Welcome everybody. Before we start, I just would like to say that I hope everyone is coping and adjusting to this new way of working. Today is my second day back in the office, quite excited about that. It's nice to pop some denim on rather than cotton and polyester, but I hope everyone out there is coping okay with this changing world. Firstly, before we start, I'll talk a little bit about myself. My name is Nick Kervin. I'm the partner in charge of technology advisory here in South Australia. I've been working in IT for almost 30 years now. I've worked across a number of different industries, including utilities, government, supply chain, logistics, and held a number of different roles. And in some roles, I've had operational responsibilities in which cost optimisation and understanding the cost of IT was very important. So that's a little bit about me. Also, if I say some words funny, that's because I'm an import from New South Wales. I say grant rather than grant, and we go dancing rather than dancing. So bear with me if I pronounce school and pool a little bit weirdly. Oops, sorry about that. Error, keyboard error. Bear with me. Right, so today's session is the first webinar in a series of 3 that will be running over the next couple of months. And just to give you a bit of an insight as to what we'll be talking about today and in the next 2 webinars. Today we're going to be covering 3 different areas: low-hanging fruit, service level, and infrastructure optimization and vendor management. We've classified these as sort of immediate activities that you can undertake to look at optimizing your IT costs. The next webinar will look at the near-term opportunities you might have around asset management, IT management, and self-service. And then the third webinar that will run in a couple of months from now will focus on longer view opportunities around portfolio management, cost optimization programs, and transparent IT. I will break during today's webinar and allow people to throw questions. They will happen at logical breaks in the content. First thing we'd like to talk about is why would you bother investing in optimizing IT costs? And some of the reasons why is obviously there is an opportunity to get greater value out of what your investment in IT and systems and services is. The opportunity to free up your resources to invest in more value-add services and activities presents itself if you're able to optimize your IT environment. Committing to a program of optimizing IT demonstrates prudency, transparency, and can increase the confidence in IT. I know that many businesses out there see that IT is a very large cost and a cost center, and taking a transparent approach to managing costs can increase confidence within the business. Taking control can lead to obviously showing leadership. It can reduce risks and confirm compliance, and also increases business ownership in optimizing IT costs. And we'll talk about stakeholder engagement a little bit further in the process of addressing your IT optimization. An IT optimization, a cost optimization approach should be structured, and rather than just being a once-off, it should be an ongoing discipline. And some of the things we'll talk about today and over the next couple of webinars will hopefully give you some tips and structure as to how to make this an ongoing activity rather than just a once-off. The reason why we have started this webinar series is we do recognise that the business world is going through a pretty significant challenge at the moment. All indicators are heading towards a global recession and possibly a recession in Australia. We thought it was a good opportunity to come and talk to you about optimization in today's environment. But again, it should be really a structured approach that lives beyond the turbulence we're going through in the short and hopefully shorter term. A structured approach to IT cost optimization will also help gain maximum value out of the tactical and strategic initiatives. So some of the things we're going to talk about today are very tactical, and later in the series we'll talk about much more strategic opportunities for you. one of the tips is that you need to invest to save money. And when we say invest, it may not just be financial investment. It may also be resource investment to being able to save some money in optimising costs. Undoubtedly, there are savings there. They do exist. Almost all IT shops will have an opportunity to save a percentage of money and optimise the way in which they're utilising IT assets. And having a formal IT cost optimization approach will actually help maintain focus and not allow a short, sharp burst which achieves a small amount and then it peters out and withers and dies. So having a structured approach to this is very important when you're taking this challenge on. So today we've got 3 focus areas, as mentioned earlier. The first is what we've called low-hanging fruit, which is essentially talking through BDO's top 10 tips for potentially receiving immediate reduction in IT spend. And I know that there's possibly a number of businesses out there that have really felt the crunch when it comes to cash flow, and they may be in need of some advice as to how to immediately save some money so that can shore up cash flow and their ability to survive through this COVID-inspired environment we're living in. The second focus area that we'll talk about is service level and infrastructure optimization, and we'll provide some recommendations and throw some questions back to you to think about as to how you might want to look at optimizing your service levels and your infrastructure. And then the third focus area will then have a look at vendor management, and again ask you some questions and provide some advice as to how to optimize your vendors' services and third-party agreements. There can be some significant savings to be made with the appropriate focus in this space. After each of these focus areas, I will pause to allow any questions to come through, and then at the end of the presentation, today's webinar, I'll also answer any questions that you might have from the content that we talk about. All right, so the top 10 tips for low-hanging fruit, and the first tip might seem a bit droll and unfortunately require a little bit of manual effort, but we suggest doing an audit of all your IT spend line by line. In a previous role that I had in an operational sense, I inherited a budget which was in a mess. I had no idea what we were actually committed to spend, and I spent hours and hours reconciling spend in our financial system over a previous spend over 2 years to try to understand exactly what our operational spend was. And it took a long time. It was late nights scouring through the data, but at the end of it, I was able to get a very accurate picture as to exactly what our operational commitments were every year. And in that particular example, I was able to hand back to the business over $1 million in operating savings because things had been committed to that were no longer valid, and the money that was being allocated to our department was way over the top as to what we actually needed. The second tip is to review subscriptions and memberships and to stop paying for things that you aren't using anymore. Over time, obviously, commitments to subscriptions and memberships can provide real value as projects or focuses are being placed onto certain areas of your IT environment. But again, it may be an area that the organisation is continuing to pay, even though they're not getting the value out of those subscriptions or memberships any further. So don't be afraid to have a look at what you're actually committing to and reevaluating if that is still a valid investment being made. The third tip is to look at all telecommunication services. Telecoms is an area that can quickly spiral out of control and can be an excellent source of reducing costs for services that are no longer needed. In that operational role that I spoke about, every month we would receive our Telstra bill, and Telstra bill printed in paper form was about the size of the yellow pages. It was massive. The effort to go through and audit those telecom services was significant, and we rarely did it. But what we eventually stumbled upon every couple of months were services that we were paying for that were actually not used any longer, or hadn't been used for a very long period of time. And when we found these, we were able to actually go back to the communications provider and cancel the service. And in most terms and most items, we're actually able to get some sort of credit demonstrating that the service hadn't been used for some time. So there are opportunities, if you're willing to sit down and go through your telecoms, to look at opportunities to reduce spend in this area. The fourth tip to look at immediately is to review any in-flight projects. And this might sound a little bit hard to stomach, but if you believe that your project isn't going to actually deliver the benefits that were originally set out to be delivered, you may actually need to shut it down. And decisions like this are generally quite hard and require courage. However, if you're not going to deliver the benefits, it's better to sink the cost than it is to keep flogging that horse that isn't going to win you any races. So don't be afraid to sit down and look at all the projects that are actually underway. And might need to turn the light back on because I've not been moving. Don't be afraid to shut down those projects that aren't actually going to deliver what you expected. Our fifth tip to immediately have a look at for low-hanging fruit is to expedite the decommissioning of any legacy applications or infrastructure. Many businesses are dealing with old systems that are no longer used. Many organisations are looking at the removal or the decommissioning of these out of their environment. And in many cases, these legacy applications or systems actually place a large draw on your IT resources as they need to continue to maintain them. Now, if you've got some of these decommissioning projects in place, evaluate if it's possible to actually expedite, because you're going to free up resourcing by taking these old systems out of your environment as quickly as you can. Low-hanging fruit tip number 6 is around landlines. I actually lost my desk phone about 12 years ago, and it was a bit of a shock. I wasn't expecting it, but the organisation I was working for back then handed me a set of headphones, and they had invested quite heavily in the implementation of a voice over IP, a VoIP telephone system, and had essentially been able to remove the need for desk phones on people's desks. So we were essentially consolidating devices down, and our laptops and our devices became, our end user device became the way in which we actually had voice communications. If your business is still grappling with landlines and you're still paying for handsets and all of the infrastructure that actually comes with that type of technology, seriously look at the opportunity to implement a VoIP solution which consolidates and then brings the ability to talk down to the computer. And although it will be a pretty significant change for your workforce, ultimately, once they've gotten over the hump of changing the way that they work, they'll grow used to it, and you won't look back at desk phones any longer. So there is a big opportunity there to optimize your IT with technology that is very proven. Voice over IP has now been around for at least a decade. The 7th tip is around printers. Some organisations over the last 10 years, as printer capabilities have increased, have taken on the challenge to rationalise printers. However, it is also a very difficult change area. Business users get very used to walking 2 meters over to their printer or having a printer in their room. That is obviously quite expensive to maintain and look after. Many printers, they are a device that consume resources, and if you are looking in ways to optimize and reduce costs, definitely look at the opportunity to rationalize the number of printers that you have, and possibly even look at replacing one-dimensional printing devices with a multi-functional device that can provide more than just spitting out pieces of paper. The 8th tip is to look at follow me printing to reduce paper and toner costs. For those that aren't that familiar, follow me printing is the ability for you to send something to the printer, but the printer won't immediately print it out. You need to go over to the printer, either use your security tag to scan or to type in your ID and password, and then you can select what you'd actually like to see printed out. Some studies have actually identified that about 17% of printed pages are not actually needed, and myself, it happens quite regularly. I'll open up a document and I will send it to the printer, only to realise that I've actually opened an old version, and I'll then go and find that older version and the newer version, and I'll send that to the printer. Now with follow me printing, you're able to actually then go to the printer and cancel the document that you didn't need to print and continue with the printing of the document that you did need to print. And when we're talking about some documents that can be hundreds of pages, or that can save organisations plenty of money when it comes to the paper and toner that is being essentially chewed through those machines. I have spoken to clients recently who don't have follow me printing and explained the benefits that this will provide and the opportunity it will present to optimise costs in this space. The last tip around printers is to review your printer contract or agreement. Many businesses out there do have outsourced printing leases and agreements with third parties, and printers are still a technology that are getting better, more efficient, and providing greater capability. It is an area that some businesses will actually just set and forget, and this obviously plays into the hands of some printer providers, because they set a price of 5 cents a page, and that's in year one, and 5 years later the client's potentially still paying 5 cents a page when there's the opportunity to reduce that per cost of printing. So if you do have the opportunity, go through your current contracts and agreements, determine if they are still valid, still in place. Look for opportunities for any savings the contract may have built into it, and if the contract is actually out of date and you're able to go out to potentially replace or seek a new partner, this is a really big opportunity to actually take your printing needs to the market. Go and talk to 4 or 5 providers of printing services and see if you can negotiate a much better rate than the one you may have negotiated or put in place years ago. If you don't have a consolidated printing contract and you've got multiple contracts, there's definitely an opportunity there to consolidate them. You may have actually gotten yourself to a point where you actually have 3 or 4 providers and they're all varying in their contracts specifications and nature. There is also a huge opportunity to negotiate based on economy of scale of combining all of your printer contracts into one piece of work for the market, and take that out to printing service organisations to hopefully negotiate a much better price for your business. The last tip, which probably won't result in an avalanche of money coming back into your bank account, but it sort of depends on how many people are actually doing this and how many employees actually put forward reimbursements for IT-related telecoms claims. I know that some organisations' policies, they do allow their staff to claim back any business-related phone calls on mobile phones, plans, and call costs. If your business is struggling with cash flow and you really are watching absolutely every penny, then this could be an area that you just need to tweak. And I know that some employees will probably get a little bit upset, but of course, if these people are using their mobile device for business reasons, they're able to claim that as a deduction. Not that I'm an accountant, you'll need to check that with your accountant. They should be able to claim it on their tax return as a business-related cost. So if you are watching every single penny, this is one way to potentially reduce some of that money that's going out to refund these employees. So they are our top 10 tips to potentially save some money and optimise your IT. If anyone has any questions about those, please shoot them through. I'll pause for just a little while to see if there's any questions. And I'm happy to answer those as they come through in the chat. Okay, no questions. Obviously, they're all nice and straightforward. Some of these tips before we move on are very applicable to the enterprise size business. Some of the tips are more applicable to the smaller business. Today's presentation will try to give some advice to all size businesses, and hopefully the people that have joined us today can take a couple of things away to think about and consider after today's discussion. All right, service level optimization. So some questions to ask about your service levels and some areas to explore. Many businesses have maintenance contracts in place with third parties that define how that third party will actually be servicing the organisation's IT. To optimise these agreements, we would highly recommend that you look at your contracts and determine if you're paying for more than you actually need. This is about right sizing your IT, and some contracts can be put in place 18 months to 24 months ago, and things change. In some instances, your IT demand in certain elements may reduce, and in others they may increase. But looking at the service levels that you've negotiated around possibly the time it takes for people to return calls, the hours that services provided. This could be an area that you look at to determine if you're paying for more than you actually need. Don't be afraid to do a little bit of reflection and determine if in the last 6 months you've actually got value out of that maintenance contract, and analyse the need for it to be continued in its current form. Don't be afraid to do some sort of cost versus risk assessment. Are there maintenance tasks that you're paying for that can actually be deferred? And is the deferral of that maintenance task still within your risk appetite? So do you have some activities that are to maintain an asset, and those activities are obviously also minimising a risk, but is there an opportunity there to stretch out the maintenance and to keep the risk profile still within your appetite for creating risk with your IT systems? Have a look at any maintenance support that you're paying for specifically business applications that are never updated, or you actually never need to call to get support. So a lot of software vendors will sell you a maintenance and support contract once you've implemented their tool, and in many instances those contracts include a retainer, include an annual fee, and can be a cost that builds up as the business implements more and more systems. Now, have you got some of those systems in which the vendor never actually updates them? So they promise that once you install version 1, every year you'd get a new version, and since installing version 1, you've never received a new version. So why are you paying for maintenance on an asset that's never actually updated? Or do you have a support agreement in place in which you paid for the ability to call them up and get help, but you don't actually use that service and you've never actually needed to call up and to get support, or it's very rare that it happens. Now, this may be an area in which you're actually paying for more than you need. So what is the right service level, and how do you optimize it? How do you ultimately get that right balance where you're paying for exactly what you actually need to consume? So this is an area that can definitely reap some rewards in essentially what can be another set and forget, where you're paying every year and not getting much value for what you're paying. Similarly, a lot of businesses will put in place, or a lot of vendors will put in place, on-call services. They may require a retainer that is paid to make sure that the on-call service is available. Don't be afraid to reflect on the use of that on-call service. And there might be opportunities to convert that from being a retainer on a monthly basis to more of a time materials. So rather than paying, for example, $1,000 a month, you may wish to renegotiate and say, we'll pay a higher per hour fee, but we're confident that we're not going to regularly require it. And over the long term of 12 months or 24 months, we'll actually save considerable money rather than paying for a service that never gets used. Infrastructure optimisation. One of the challenges that has evolved over the last decade or so is around the introduction of virtualized computing. So way back in sort of the early 2000s, when you needed a new server to run your HR system or a new server to run your financial system, back then you had to order a piece of hardware, and that piece of hardware had to be specified and then went off to a hardware manufacturer, and 4 to 6 weeks later you had the piece of hardware in your office, and you then installed that piece of hardware in your data center or your closet, and you then had to load up all the software on that piece of software, that piece of hardware, then you had to put your HR system on it, and that process took anywhere from 2, 3, 4, 6 months. It was quite slow. It used to frustrate many people, but it also had a significant control point, which was the receipt of a actual piece of IT equipment that had blinking lights and a hard disk and motherboards, etc. And then in the mid 2000s, about 15 years ago, virtual environments, the virtual environment technology took off, and you were able to then install on a single piece of hardware multiple environments. Now, one of those benefits was obviously that there was a huge saving in the time that it took to commission a new server. So rather than saying, oh, yep, you need a new server for your HR system, that'll be 3 months, the IT team would say you need a new server for your HR system, that will be 3 hours. But of course, with that flexibility comes the opportunity to potentially then overbloat or create an IT environment that isn't quite the right size. And the first tip around analysing your virtual environment footprint is to understand what non-production environments you've got. So that is to have a look at all those servers that were created to support the implementation. That might be called a UAT server, or it might be a system testing server. It might be a pre-prod server. The implementation of projects can result in a number of different servers being created, and then they can be left in limbo and still active. So there is an opportunity there to have a look at the way in which your non-production environments are actually configured, and look at what can be decommissioned or archived, so you may save on support, maintenance, or licensing costs. The second element to look at in a virtual environment is the opportunity to consolidate. So again, when it only takes 3 hours to create a new virtual environment, it's very easy for someone just to be a bit lazy and create a new one whenever anyone asks for it. There are opportunities to reduce the number of virtual environments by consolidating them and putting 3 single environments onto one. And again, looking at that consolidation opportunity might also present yourself with the ability to save support, maintenance, and license costs on the number of actual servers that you have in your environment. And the third point to look at when looking at your virtual environment, do you have any underutilized environments that can be right-sized? So have you got any virtual environments that were set up expecting a massive pressure placed on utilization and being built for more than what was required? And can you do Can you right-size those virtual environments to decrease the footprint that it then places on all of your infrastructure, potentially optimizing your IT for what is actually needed, not was actually built. The second point is around bring your own device, and this is the acronym of BYOD has been around for a good decade or so. It has slowly been adopted by some businesses, and others have definitely stayed away from BYOD. Ultimately, it's about allowing employees to bring their own device to work and be able to work off that device rather than using a device supplied by the organisation. I did this a few years ago. I had my own MacBook, which I loved when I was a freelance consultant, and I'd just turn up at client sites and work off that MacBook, sometimes connecting to the network and sometimes not. But of course, it lowered the cost to the client that I was working for because I didn't require them to give me a device or connect me to the internet with an account, etc. So this is an opportunity. If you haven't considered BYOD before, I'd suggest putting it onto your radar, doing some analysis, understanding what the cost would be to allow BYOD in your environment, but then look at the savings you may actually be able to achieve by not having to provide every single person in your business with a device that is supplied and managed and supported by your IT team. So it's an area that can definitely lead to some optimization when it comes to the infrastructure that you need to look after and support. And the third point, do you have any network services that can be consolidated? Again, for businesses that have many sites and sometimes a very complex network architecture in which sites are connected with network links provided by service providers, is there an opportunity to look at that architecture and consolidate? And again, it's a space that can easily blow out of control. In today's age, it's very easy to ring someone up and create a link between two different offices. It's very easy to commission, and it's quite feasible that you've actually started paying for some services that can be consolidated. So if you do think that you may be paying for more than you need when it comes to network servicing in your business, don't be afraid to ask for some help, for someone to come in and have a look at that, to give it a sanity check to make sure that you are paying for what you need, or opportunities in which services between sites can actually be consolidated down into a single service rather than paying for multiple services. There could be some significant optimization and cost reduction opportunities in this space. Staying on the theme of infrastructure optimization, do you have any redundant network links that can be removed by a redesign? So similarly to the previous point, consolidation is an opportunity to take multiple links and reduce them down to a single link and paying for less for that single link. Do you actually have any redundant links that can be removed by a redesign of your network? And in some cases, a network designed across multiple sites can become quite spaghetti-like. With connections going every which way. There might actually be opportunities where you can remove a line completely because you're able to create a network between sites that doesn't rely on a point-to-point solution. So there may be opportunities for you to review redundant links. An area that many businesses don't regularly review is backups and your strategy and schedule. So backups are obviously very important for redundancy and being able to recover systems if there is a loss of your servers or your primary data center. In many instances, when the project is implemented in the first instance to get backup in place, a strategy and a schedule is defined. But it's not very often that businesses say that on a periodic basis, they're going to go and review that strategy and schedule. And like most things, if it isn't looked at and right-sized or at least readjusted for what the business needs, you could actually be paying for or have a non-optimized backup design. So don't be afraid to call in the vendor or the IT guys or your backup specialist and ask them to review the current strategy and schedule, just to make sure that the amount of backup and the frequency is aligned with what is expected and required for your business now, rather than what was potentially put in place 12 to 18 months previously. Another area that many vendors like to talk to you about is support on hardware and warranty. And I'm sure that there's been many instances of the people out there that amazingly, when a piece of equipment or hardware gets a little bit long in the tooth, the cost to support it increases, which is definitely helping vendors replace and sell new hardware. Sometimes, and if this is within your risk appetite, sometimes it's quite feasible for you to continue on with a piece of equipment that is out of support or it does not have warranty, but your choice to do that needs to fit within your risk appetite. So if it's a system sitting on a server, that it doesn't really matter if it goes down for a couple of days and it's backed up. Maybe there is an opportunity to actually stop the warranty and support payments on that piece of hardware. I'd obviously suggest that you wouldn't do this for mission critical systems, but just analysing exactly what you're paying for on what bits of hardware and what potentially can be dropped may actually provide some relief when it comes to the money going out the door on a regular basis to provide warranty and support on hardware that is not really that critical for your organisation. The last optimisation opportunity for infrastructure is looking at outsourcing your SOE, and SOE stands for Standard Operating Environment. The SOE generally refers to the way in which a PC is configured so that it works within your network and has all of your business applications already loaded on it, so that when a new PC is actually commissioned or built, the SOE is installed onto that PC, so that when you start it up, you have access immediately to your HR or your financial system. That can actually be quite a time-consuming task, managing the standard operating environment, and there are opportunities to give that to the organisation that supplies your PCs, so that when they give you a new PC, your SOE is already loaded onto it. This could be a great way of getting some people in your IT team into your to focus from this menial task of loading up an SOE for every new PC. You could actually outsource that and get that person or team to focus on much more value-adding tasks for the organisation. I've seen this successfully done in a number of different businesses where they gave the responsibility of managing the SOE to the PC provider, and they were very successful in having the SOE loaded on every new machine that was delivered to the desk of the employee that had requested a new desktop or laptop. Again, I'll pause here for 30 seconds and take any questions that might be out there on service level optimization or infrastructure optimization. All right. Now we move on to vendor management and some tips to help you think about potentially optimizing your vendor IT services. So most businesses out there will have some vendors providing service to the organization. Not every organization can do everything, so there's generally expertise required, and vendors provide that. The first question to ask yourself is, do you actually have a vendor map and a contract register that provide you with an understanding as to what vendor does what, and a contract register that indicates when contracts will expire and due for renewal? I know that in previous jobs and the the role that I mentioned before, there was absolutely no form of understanding when a contract would expire. So I was most of the time I was actually sent a email from the vendor saying, "Hey, did you know this is about to be this contract is about to expire and needs to be renewed?" Now, if you're unable to see what's coming up, then you're actually providing yourself with little time to prepare and to understand what your negotiation position might be. If the vendor is telling you 3 days out from the contract's expiry that it needs to be renewed, that leaves you very little time to actually mount a case for improved services or some sort of reduction in costs, etc., especially if what that vendor is providing is seen as a mission critical service. So having some sort of forward view and a reminder coming up that in a month a contract is due for renewal, that will give you time to prepare. It will give you time to think about the value of that service, what the vendor's been providing, and potentially how you can negotiate a better deal when it comes around for renewal. This might seem a little bit tedious, but again, I think you will get value out of it. But review all contracts, all of your vendor services, and identify areas of poor performance. And don't be afraid to begin discussions about remediation and/or fee discounts. I know that a lot of businesses out there see their vendor as a partner. They want to work closely with them. Sometimes this partner relationship can make it difficult to identify areas that are poor in performance. However, you're not going to get the optimum vendor service unless you're able to have a transparent discussion around any areas that were actually poorly delivered. And it is important to bring these up and to talk to the vendor about how they get remediated. It's not all about, shouldn't all be about saving money and fee discounts or credits. It should be about making sure that you're getting what you have paid for. If you do have a pretty complex and lengthy set of vendors that are providing you with services, there'd definitely be an opportunity to look at your vendor spend, roll it up into a pivot table and determine who you are actually spending most of your money with. And I'm quite sure that if you have some vendors that have done quite well, and as a consultant, this has definitely been done for me on a number of occasions, sit down and ask if there's an opportunity to negotiate potentially better rates due to the volume of work that you're giving to the vendor. As I said, I've had this happen a couple of times in which the client that I've been working with went through this vendor analysis, and we're in the top 5, and we were asked to come in and talk about how we could work, obviously, together with a better commercial deal for the vendor, because they were seeing large quantities of consulting work being given to BDO. And I'm happy to have that conversation, because as long as we're working together and they're happy to use our services, then there's always an opportunity to talk about commercial matters. If you've got vendors that are providing you with commodity services, so these are pretty stock standard services that are provided by many different businesses, what are the opportunities for you to take this back out to market to negotiate potentially better services and better rates? So definitely there is an acknowledgement that some vendors provide a very specific service that no other vendor can provide, and therefore the opportunity to take these services out to the market may be a bit limited. But if it's something that is pretty common and offered by many businesses, don't be afraid to get some help to put together what you're looking for, take it out to market, and test the waters to see if there's a better deal out there. Certainly, we've all experienced this with certain commodity items that we consume ourselves on an individual basis. There's plenty of opportunities to actually shop around and find, with the access to the internet and shopping these days, to find the best deal that you can get. Don't be afraid to do the same with your IT services to optimize them. And the last point around vendor management, if you're paying for time material services for a particular vendor, and this may be, there's no agreed actual amount of work, but every month they give you a time materials invoice for the work they've performed in that month. is there an opportunity to negotiate a more service outcome-based agreement? So if you've been working with a vendor for, let's say, 12 months, and they've been charging you every month on a pretty regular basis, but it's just time and materials on a pretty high rate, there may be an opportunity for you to go back to that vendor and say, over the course of 12 months, this is what we've spent. We'd actually like to lock in the same services at a lower cost, which gives the vendor a surety of the work coming in, and you can potentially negotiate a better commercial rate. A little bit of the converse of the recommendation before, which was you may be paying for a service and not getting any actual value out of it. This is the opposite to that, where you're actually paying a higher price for the service, where you can negotiate a better deal if it was on a more commercial service-based agreement. Now I'll just pause there if there's any questions on vendor management for a little while, have a drink of water, and then we'll move on to the last few slides. Very good. No questions around vendors. That's good. Don't be afraid to go and have a conversation with yours. Now, what to avoid? Certainly launching some sort of structured IT cost optimization program is a great initiative, but there are things to avoid when doing this. It's not all just plain sailing. So some things to avoid is cutting the wrong costs. So don't make the mistake of cutting costs or services in the wrong spots, and make sure that you understand what's the priority, and that may be reduction in operating costs, and may be reduction in capital costs, and may be reduction in both. So don't fall into the trap of just cutting costs without understanding what might be a priority for your business, what might be a pressure on cash flow, and make sure that you understand what is important to focus on when it comes to a cost optimization approach. Make sure that you keep one eye on your risks and imperative services. So I would highly suggest not cutting costs in areas like cybersecurity. Cyber threats are not going to go away. They're going to just increase. You may wish to look at the service agreements you've got in place, but be very careful when analysing any opportunity to optimise these, because this is obviously a space in which you don't want to stinge, because no one likes essentially being taken out of action because of a cyber incident. So make sure that you keep an eye on your risks and imperative services. Any IT cost optimization program shouldn't be launched in isolation. It's very important to communicate and engage stakeholders. So don't go off into the dark corner and take on the challenge of trying to optimize costs, because ultimately what you might do is confuse and potentially put some people off with what you're trying to do. So make sure that communication is open, you're engaging people and describing what you're trying to achieve with any type of structured approach. It's also important to understand that cost reduction in some areas will rely on a stable, standardized and mature service. So this point is saying if you've got a service that is wildly unstable, is very complex, not standard, isn't mature, this possibly is an area that you should be focusing on to reduce costs or optimize, because ultimately it's best to be optimizing and reducing costs on something that is not going to create headaches if it's not bedded down. Don't avoid on just the dollars. I know a lot of what we've talked about today is about cost savings and reducing costs, but don't focus just on the dollars. There'll be opportunities there to be multi-dimensional in what is actually being optimized, and it may be freeing up resources, it may be outsourcing a headache, it may be getting the right balance between risk and reward. And the last point is don't create technology debt for the sake of saving dollars. And when we say debt, we're talking about creating a problem that someone in the future will then have to fix because you've created some sort of debt that needs to be resolved. So just make sure that any decisions that are made certainly keep into consideration any debt that's created, and don't forsake the savings of dollars to create that debt, which will eventually have to be repaid anyway. The last slide talks about a case study of an organisation that took IT cost optimisation very seriously, and provides 3 basic steps that they took, which helped them achieve some pretty significant savings. So the first step was that they completed a detailed IT cost breakdown, and as mentioned a couple of times today, they got an export of financials. They categorised it if it wasn't already categorised, and they grouped it together to understand exactly where all their costs were in the IT department. After they got all the costs into a single repository of information, they then completed a top-down and detailed cost benchmarking exercise where they looked at the costs and they did some benchmarking against what might be the right amount of financial spend compared to others. And there's benchmarking data available that you can use to then compare, and will potentially give you things like the cost of maintaining a PC per user, plus a number of different metrics that will help you work out where you sit when benchmarked against other organisations. And once they'd completed that benchmarking, they then developed a detailed action plan and quantified the results of the activities that they undertook. So some of the things that they looked at in this action plan was their cloud footprint, their FTEs, they looked at contracts, they looked at in and outsourcing services, they looked at demand and response, and they looked at their projects. And the ultimate outcome from this structured approach was that they are eventually able to identify 24% IT cost reduction. And in their specific scenario, that represented about $16 million. Obviously, that is all relative to the size of the business, but it demonstrates that taking a methodical and scientific approach to this, you'll reap the rewards if you commit to actioning some optimization activities that will help you hopefully reduce your costs and optimize your IT. There, of course, is value in using a benchmarking toolkit, which will help improve customer experience, reduce costs, reduce risk and increase compliance, utilization of assets, etc. So these types of benchmarking activities will help you understand exactly where you sit and where you're paying potentially over for the services that you're receiving. So that is the last slide of the deck. We've got a couple more minutes for any last questions that might be out there. So if anyone has any questions, if you'd like to just type them into the chat window. Maybe while we're waiting to see if there's any questions, we did have a question asked before the webinar, which was the following. We're looking to install NetSuite in the next few months. Are there any additional risks and considerations with the third party providing the implementation, given that they work remotely now? Now, this is a really good question, and one that I spoke to with a colleague, a client yesterday. So he said, how do we all digitally transform when we're working remotely? And it's a similar question to this one, which is how do you implement a new system if no one's on site and everyone's working from home? From my point of view, the technical challenges around a system implementation are not an issue when people are working remotely. IT has been essentially IT's been working remotely for a long time. There are many tools that IT vendors use to dial in and obviously get access to clients' infrastructure to be able to set up and install new systems. I think the challenge, though, is the human challenge. So implementing a new system like NetSuite, and we'll see a significant change in the day-to-day activities of the finance department and possibly other departments as they adopt the new system. consideration needs to be given as to how those people will, the users affected will actually be supported to change. And I would suggest that running online training will be key, but also having a very clear and present support function for those users as they start using the system on day one. They need to know who they can call, who they can contact, who they can message to get help. In a typical office-based environment, there'd be people walking around on the floor with colourful t-shirts, or there'd be the vendor sitting 2 desks away ready to answer any questions. In this scenario, it needs to be very clear as to how that person gets support in the first few days as they're traversing the change challenge ahead of them of using a new system. So technically, no issues with implementation being done remotely. Non-technical and human, yes, some challenges there to bring everyone along for the ride and to help get over that change hurdle. Well, there's no other questions. Thank you very much for attending today's session. We do appreciate your time, and we hope that you've been able to take a couple of things away to go off and look at. We will be in contact after today's session to get feedback and to look at obviously any suggestions to improve these webinars, and look forward to speaking to you about that feedback soon, and hope you have a good remainder of your Thursday. Thank you very much for joining us.